Shalom, my name is Aaron. Welcome again to our Torah study. We're looking at the Torah portion called Miketz, which in Hebrew means at the end, although sometimes it's translated it came to pass, but usually is a time reference. It means at the end of something. The actual Torah portion that we're going to be studying is from Genesis 41 through to Genesis 44, verse 17. And in context, we're finding our hero at the moment, which is Joseph. Yosef is still in prison. He has been interpreting the dreams of his fellow prisoners and behaving himself very well in prison. He's gaining high esteem amongst his other captives, but he still remains in prison. And what we find our hero beginning to do is he's actually now sort of entering into his calling. He's entering into his prophetic gift, which is the gift of discernment. He can interpret dreams. He started his adventures as a dreamer himself, right? He had the dreams originally, and he then told the dreams to his brothers and his father, which got him into all kinds of trouble. But now, as he's getting older, wiser, had more experience, and unfortunately suffered, then that in awakens in him the gift of dream interpretation, and he can, by the Spirit of God, interpret other people's dreams. He stops dreaming himself and is now involved in other people's dreams. And that's a good thing. That this sort of partnership idea, which we see running all the way through the scriptures. There are those that have dreams, and there are those that interpret dreams. There are those that speak words of knowledge or speak tongues of angels. There are those that interpret tongues, where we need all of these gifts. If we all find all of the gifts in one person, that's a very suspicious person. That would be God himself, and so you would normally not find all the gifts in one individual. So the Torah portion starts. It came to pass, or Eime Miketz, it came at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river. So now the dreamers are not the Jewish people. The dreamers, as we're seeing in the book of Genesis, are the Gentiles. Jews and Gentiles need to work together. Ooh, what a surprise. This has always been the plan of God for Jews and Gentiles to work together. And we're seeing it almost quite clearly here, where the ruler of the known world at the time, an unnamed hero, Pharaoh. Pharaoh is not his name, Pharaoh is his job. We don't know which Pharaoh we're talking about. There is a lot of scholarly debate as to who is actually being referred to here. We don't know. Are these the Hyksos, the foreign Semitic rulers of Egypt? Not sure. Are these the pharaohs before or after the Hyksos dynasties? The point is, Pharaoh is the one dreaming. God is speaking to a Gentile, and he recognizes that this is an otherworldly experience. It is not just a normal dream. He dreams in verse 2. Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine looking and fat, good cow, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river. We're here talking about the Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt. It's rising and falling, and flooding of the delta is the breadbasket of the world, and gives Egypt the ability to produce food, therefore sustain a large population, and therefore sustain a large army and be an empire. The first necessity for empire, what is it? Water. Right? Water, the stuff of life. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And what is the word? The heavens, hashamayim, the waters. Okay? Water is an incredible key ingredient in creation. The Spirit of God hovers over the water, brooding. And the rivers of life come from the Messiah and from God. Water is an incredibly important ingredient. So out of this river, very important to Egypt in particular, come these gaunt cows. They're ugly, gaunt, and they ate up the seven fine-looking and fat cows. And so Pharaoh awoke. So he awakes. He understands that I've had some sort of dream sequence. I don't know what it is. And he then goes to seek those that might be able to interpret it for him. But his magicians, his sages, his wise men, and it gives the word for both the magician, who is the worker of some sort of divine power. Exactly how humans have access to this is not told in our scriptures, but they do. And the wise men, the hachamim, the literally means the wise men, people who have knowledge and have studied and have access to scholarly academic history. He asks them about his dream, and they can't interpret it for him. And then you get that incident where Joseph is remembered, and Pharaoh then calls Joseph. Now, Joseph, as we have said in a few Torah portions to studies, a few wrestles of our scripture, was supposed to be the firstborn of Jacob. Jacob loved Rachel, and he wanted Rachel. He didn't want the other girls. He ended up with 12 sons, but if he had only actually married Rachel and not married the others, he only would have had two, which fits the pattern of the other heroes, right? Abraham has Isaac and Ishmael, and Isaac has Jacob and Esau, and Jacob should have had just Joseph and Benjamin, but he ends up with the whole 12 tribes. So Joseph should have been child number one, but wasn't. Was one of the more later children, and number 11 actually. And but now he's been spending a lot of time away from his family. In fact, we're going to discover that Joseph is 30 years of age. He was put into a prison when he was 17. So he's spending nearly half his life as a prisoner. And so it's during those times of incarceration, it's during those times of suffering, it's during those times of trial and tribulation that actually his spiritual gift is developing. His calling is coming into. What does Paul say in the New Testament? Suffering produces perseverance, character. Suffering is not something we desire to go through. In fact, in the Lord's Prayer, we ask the Lord not to take us through times of trial. But when we do go through them, because sometimes they're good for us, because sometimes that's where the refining really does need to happen, then we say, protect us from the evil one. We understand that there is this thing called suffering. We don't like it. We don't always understand it. But it is the thing that develops character. And many of us who have gone through trials will say that we bless the Lord for those experiences, and may we all get to that place where we can say those things. But going back to our story, Pharaoh needs his dream interpreted. He's nervous that he thinks that there's something from the divine ones. Notice he doesn't call his priests, right? He doesn't say, hey, get me the gods of Egypt. So there's something interesting about this Pharaoh, something interesting about this dynasty. And because during the Joseph event in Egypt, we don't talk about other Egyptian gods, although we do end up having one in a minute when Joseph marries one. So at the moment, the Egyptian gods are aloof, they're out of the story. The chief butler remembers, well, there used to be this young Hebrew man, okay, and he the servant of Potiphar, and he interpreted dreams, and it was true. So in chapter 41, verse 14, it says, Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon, and he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. And then we get Joseph succeeding in interpreting the dream. Interestingly, the word for take him out of the dungeon is the word board. Ha-board. Actually, it says it's the dungeon or the pit. It's actually not the word for dungeon. That's a different word. The word board is usually the word for cistern or something that you dig in the ground and fill up with water. It's the same word, ha-bor is found in Genesis 37, verse 24. That's in the previous Torah portion. That's where the brothers put Joseph. So when Joseph is captured by his brothers, he's put into a pit. And it says they put him in ha-bor, the pit. And here that word appears again, where Pharaoh takes him out of ha-bor, the pit. So beginnings and endings, we are seeing this right here. Joseph at 17 went into the pit, and he just knew suffering from then, and trial and tribulation. But now Pharaoh takes him out of the pit. He began in a pit, he ends coming out of the pit. Pharaoh takes him out. Pharaoh then listens to him. Joseph says it's all God who's doing this. God, in verse 25 of chapter 41, it says, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. And here he is talking about the Lord God. He uses the word actually Elohim. The God is doing this. And then Pharaoh responds when he says to his servants, in verse 37 of chapter 41. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh says to his servants, so he's gathered his conclave around, and he says, can we find such a man who has the Spirit of God, the Ruach Elohim? So Joseph, in talking to Pharaoh, says Elohim is the one that's going to interpret these dreams for you, not one of your gods, or whatever you've got. And Pharaoh acknowledges this. Who has the Spirit of God? Or the spirit of this God I've never heard. He doesn't say that. Ruach Elohim. It's as though Pharaoh actually acknowledges, well, there actually is this thing called God. And then he says, in so much as Elohim has shown this to you, there is no one discerning as wise as you, Joseph, so you do it. And Joseph is elevated to the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. So beginnings and endings occur in the same way, in the same pattern, in the same form that we see in all throughout Scripture. A virgin like Eve is the one who hears the voice of God and disobeys. And so the New Testament begins by a virgin hearing the voice of God and obeying, because what started the problem needs to be part of the solution. Same goes through now here with Joseph. He was put into a pit. He's taken out of a pit, and he's beginning this new journey. So in our lives, we should probably look for things like beginnings and endings, and same sort of situations that begin and end. And that's a very Jewish way, very Hebraic way, very God way of dealing and working with his creation. One of the questions that our Jewish brothers ask is, why is Joseph allowed to become the second most important person in all of Egypt? Why is he allowed to become like Pharaoh? What's his skills? What's his qualifications? What gives him the ability to do this? And when you look at the text, and Jewish people have had these texts for thousands of years, they discover that our dear brother Joseph didn't go to school. Right? He didn't sit as a disciple with somebody. At 17, he was separated from his family and spent most of his time in slavery. He didn't go to university. He wasn't a student of a rabbi. He didn't have access to the Torah, hadn't been written yet. Where does he get his wisdom from? And their conclusion is it's less about your education, although education is good. I'm not saying it's not good. You should gain knowledge. In fact, the Proverbs ask us, seek knowledge, gain wisdom, get understanding. Okay, knowledge is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. But the primary thing that you need to be a hero of God is good character. And when you have a look at in the New Testament, in the epistles of Titus and Timothy, when Paul is writing to these young men, and he says, I'll give you some advice on how you choose your leadership. He doesn't say choose your leaders who have been to Bible college. He doesn't say choose your leaders who have lots of letters at the end of their name, BA, MA, PhD. He said the list of qualities that are part of a good leader are all characteristics, character. What is God looking for? Character. If you don't have character, you can have as much wisdom as you like, but you won't succeed. You can be the smartest man on the planet like Solomon, but if you don't have good character, you'll fall like he did into idolatry, into things like that. You need to have good character. Joseph is a good example. He has good character, and as well as actually the Spirit of God and the gifts. He's got a gift too. He's got the gift of dream interpretation, and he uses that, and he wisely then prepares the world for a famine. Now, the famine that comes is, according to the Midrash, universal. All of the known world suffers a famine. And usually in the Bible, a famine is related to immorality. Just like the world went immoral and ended up with a flood, the world again went on a trajectory towards immorality, and famine swept the land. And who was the redeeming figure? It was Joseph. It was Joseph who had been sent through a period of suffering to get to the place of redemption, the place of salvation, the place where he could actually redeem the world. And that's what he does. He feeds the world. God uses him in a very unique way, and he becomes a typology for Jewish people as well as for Christians. In fact, we're borrowing it from Jewish people of the Messiah. When Jewish sages looked at the Hebrew Bible, they saw prophecies that talked about a Messiah who was strong and powerful, and he was called Mashiach ben David, the Messiah, the son of David. But they also noticed that there were texts that talked about a suffering servant, a someone who would actually perish and die, and people would mourn for him. You would mourn for one whom you pierced. Well, the Jewish commentators say this is Mashiach ben Yosef, Messiah, the son of Joseph. So the typology of Joseph and David are the two types of messiahs that you find in the scriptures. Now, we understand them as being one person, but in streams of Judaism, they are two advents. But notice where Joseph goes. Joseph has to be separated from his brothers, and he goes and becomes Lord of the Gentiles. Kind of what has happened to Jesus, has it not? And there are some very other great pieces of Midrash which discuss that. Where do we go and find Jesus? Where do we go and find the Messiah? I'm sorry. Where do we go find the Messiah? Oh, he's hiding out with the Gentiles, which is something that we see in our day right now. All right. The last thing I'd like to look at before we finish, there's a lot more in the Torah portion, of course, but we've got lots more years ahead to study, is towards the end of the Torah portion, actually what in the next chapter, chapter 42, in verse 1 of Genesis, it says, Then Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt. And Jacob says to his sons, Why do you look at one another? We have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down to that place, buy there, and we may live and not die. Jacob sends some of his kids to Egypt. He himself stays in the land. He's doing his calling, right? He was called to inherit the land. So he's doing it. Here he's called Jacob's, not Israel, even though the angel has changed his name. He doesn't get renamed like that yet. But Jacob sees that there is grain in Egypt. What doesn't he see? He doesn't see Joseph in Egypt. So he sees part of the picture. He doesn't see the whole picture. He sees the redemption. He sees we can get saved. We can get grain from Egypt. They have it. Go and get some. But he doesn't see the source of it. He doesn't see that this is actually his son. So it's the sages would note, and it's a good thing for us to learn, or as Paul says as well, we only see through a glass darkly. We don't always see the whole picture. We see part of the picture. We don't see the whole picture. Who does see the whole picture? Well, that's God. That's the Messiah. That's the Spirit. And so we need to trust the Lord. Like, you have the whole picture. I only see part of the picture, which means I don't always understand what's going on. But do I have to? We sometimes think we really, really have to, but we still have to walk out the story, that we have to walk out the path that God has chosen in front of us, trusting that He has the whole picture, even if I don't. And so Jacob, while he can see only part of the picture, he ends up actually becoming attached to Egypt, and the children of Israel will indeed go and come to Egypt, and they will, and we'll pick up the story in our next portion where where Joseph and the brothers meet, the revelation of himself, and some of the interesting ways that the Bible presents that story. Thanks for wrestling with the scriptures, guys, and blessings on your week.